Hello, everyone. This is Annamarie McKellips, and I'm recording my first podcast for the MESH program on the circularity of hazardous waste. The imports and exports of hazardous waste are regulated by the Department of Toxic Substances Control and the Environmental Protection Agency. California Code of Regulations, Title 22, Division 4.5, Chapter 12, Article 8 establishes regulations for the import and export of RCRA waste, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. RCRA waste is defined under the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40, Section 261.3. Any non-RCRA waste, in my circumstances, is usually California waste. Hazardous waste can be California and RCRA waste, but can also be exclusively only a California waste. Hazardous waste management laws are meant to ensure that hazardous waste shipped to and from this country is done so with proper documentation and methodology for handling and movement of hazardous waste. In 1983, the La Paz Agreement began the cooperation between the United States and Mexico for environmental protection along the border's shared boundary of the two countries. This led to the creation of U.S. EPA's and DTSC's California-Mexico Border Program and the Import-Export Program for both the state and federally. OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is an international organization with 38 countries working cooperatively to find solutions for a range of social, economic, and environmental challenges. Members of this group comply with the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Movement of waste between the United States and Mexico is under the scrutiny of the La Paz Agreement and OECD. So why does any of this matter? As a hazardous waste regulator for Cal EPA, I have the opportunity to see firsthand the imports and exports for the US and Mexico border as a part of my regular duties at the Southern California border. I can provide some insights to the hazardous waste that I see most commonly as a part of the circular economy involved in the transnational movement of hazardous waste. But first, we need some background information on hazardous waste determination and classification. The hazardous waste identification process usually goes, is it waste or is it excluded? If it is waste, it then goes to whether it is listed or characteristic. And if that's the case, if there are exclusions or exemptions to listed or characteristic waste, and then finally the hazardous waste management accordingly. There are two ways that hazardous waste can be determined as hazardous waste under federal and state regulations. The waste either displays characteristics of ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity, or it is a listed waste. For the characteristic defined waste, there are thresholds set forth by the federal government and California thresholds that are typically more stringent. For the listed waste, it does not have to exhibit any of the characteristics listed above, but it is listed because of the dangerous qualities of the waste or process that leads to its generation. For example, fluorescent light bulbs containing mercury and electronic devices like cell phones or computers contain toxic chemicals like lead and cadmium, which qualify these items as hazardous waste. The determination process is much more complicated and nuanced than this, but for the sake of time, this is a simplified version on how hazardous waste is determined. I wanted to provide the background information necessary to set the scene for hazardous waste commodities that are a part of the circular economy in our current commerce crossing into and out of our national boundary. Sustainable waste management is important for protecting the environment and public health. It can also conserve precious natural resources and have tremendous economic benefits. Some ways toward sustainable hazardous waste management include Recycling. Recycling is one of the ways that sustainable hazardous waste management can be achieved. Technology items typically have materials like lead, zinc, nickel in them that make them dangerous to the public health and the environment. There is a material recovery process that technology items can go through to use these compounds for other products to keep them out of landfills. Recover materials. Companies can recover materials from hazardous waste and use them in other products. The recovered materials can, in some cases, be exempt from being managed as hazardous waste and excluded from disposal requirements. Working cooperatively with industries. Companies can work with others in the industry to foster supply chain relationships. Byproducts of certain industrial processes can be used by others in a similar industry. Follow regulations. Regulations like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, from the Environmental Protection Agency encourage sustainable practices. Properly generating, transporting, treating, or disposing of hazardous waste so that they may mitigate the negative impacts to human health and the environment. Prevent waste generation. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Toxic Substances Control encourages reducing the amount of hazardous waste generated at its source. Reducing hazardous waste generation at the source is pollution prevention in and of itself. Use non-hazardous materials. Promote the use of non-hazardous materials. Processes can be augmented to exclude certain practices that would generate hazardous waste. The waste management hierarchy is first, source reduction, secondarily, reuse and recycle, thirdly, treatment, and lastly, disposal if necessary. Source reduction and Senate Bill 14. Senate Bill 14 requires generators to look at their waste generating processes and identify source reduction opportunities. It encourages the industry to constantly consider ways to make improvements. Successfully reducing hazardous waste generation also saves industry money through necessary management thereafter. Reducing hazardous waste at the source is good for the environment. Some of the ways of diverting hazardous waste from disposal is excluded recyclable materials, or ERM. Some recyclable materials are excluded from classification as a waste provided if they meet the conditions in Health and Safety Code section 25143.2. Exclusions. Several federal exclusions from the definitions of solid hazardous waste have been adopted in California. Therefore, substances can be excluded under federal law that are hazardous waste in California. The federal exemption for discarded commercial products, off-specification species, container residues, or spill residues thereof that are applied to the land and application to the land is their ordinary manner of use, or that are fuels, or the exemption for commercial chemical products that are reclaimed speculatively accumulated. These wastes are classified as non-RCRA hazardous waste under Title 22, California Code of Regulations 66261.2 D1 and 2. Recyclable material is defined as any hazardous waste that is capable of being recycled, including but not limited to any of the following: A residue, B, a spent material, used or spent stripping or plating solution or etchant, C, a material that is contaminated to such an extent that it can no longer be used for its original purpose, D, a byproduct listed in section 66261.31 or section 66261.32, E, any retrograde material that has not been used, distributed, or reclaimed through treatment by the original manufacturer or owner by one of the following dates, 1 year after the date when the material became a retrograde material, and 2, if the material has been returned to the original manufacturer 1 year after the material is returned. One of the most common ERM that I see at the ports of entry is ground metals that are meant for reclaiming precious metals. These commodities have to be approved and vetted by DTSC and EPA on an individual basis and have to be headed toward a permitted and designated recycling facility. Another category of hazardous waste that can be diverted from landfills is scrap metal, and it is defined as any one of the following except as provided in subsection B of this section. Manufactured solid metal objects and products, metal workings including cuttings, trimmings, stampings, grindings, shavings, and sandings, solid metal residues or metal production residues, printed circuit boards that are recycled. The most common example of scrap metal that I see at the ports of entry is often the PC circuit boards. If they have the batteries removed, they are considered scrap metal. I also see cuttings of metal or ground metal, and they meet the exclusion criteria as long as they are no less than 100 microns in diameter and they do not exceed certain thresholds for toxic metal content, such as lead, cadmium, chromium, etc. Another excluded category is American Products Returned, or what we refer to as APR. APR as hazardous waste refers to consumer products that are brought into the United States that are considered hazardous when discarded, meaning they contain chemicals that harm human health or the environment if not disposed of properly, such as old batteries, paint cans, cleaning products, pesticides, certain electronics, and some cosmetics, which can be returned to retailers or disposed of at designated hazardous waste facilities. The most common APR that I see is empty aerosol cans or solo stoves, like the ones that they sell for roasting marshmallows commercially. The state of California has only 2 permitted hazardous waste landfill facilities. I will introduce some environmental concerns pertaining to my case study in the upcoming Mesh magazine about hazardous waste, transportation, and disposal trends, and California's rapid loss of capacity for proper disposal of hazardous waste. For now, I'd like to focus on the recyclability, reusability aspect. About 60% of the state's hazardous waste, or 12.5 million tons, has been landfilled since 2010, while about 24% was shipped for recycling and 2% was incinerated. States are required to maintain at least 20 years of capacity for their hazardous waste to receive federal compensation from CERCLA, or Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act. If all hazardous waste was managed within state boundaries, the 2 remaining landfills would only have 9.5 years of capacity remaining. Given the decline in hazardous waste management facilities over time and more stringent requirements for operating permitted facilities, it is anticipated that California's hazardous waste management capacity will be further reduced and that more California-generated hazardous waste will be shipped to other states. Nearly half of all the hazardous waste generated in California since 2010 has been shipped to other countries or other states, including millions of tons to each Utah, Arizona, and Nevada being the top 3 recipients. As I mentioned, I will be expanding on this topic more in my first volume of the Mesh magazine. All of the hazardous wastes and hazardous materials that I observe on a regular basis at the ports of entry have opened up new considerations on how there are many ways we can improve the management of hazardous waste with more sustainable methods. Hopefully, this podcast can bring some inspiration toward reaching zero waste. Thank you for listening.